I'm not a Nazi, not a fascist, not a racist, not anything else. According to National Geographic, there's no scientific basis for race, it's a made-up label. It's been used to define and separate people for millennia, but the concept of race is not grounded in genetics. So, now we have all the racists crying in the comments. Let's get on with the history, shall we? Mosley and the British Union of Fascists were the largest British fascist movement, and so we're going to look at them today. But here's the thing. They weren't the first fascists, sort of. The first National Socialist organisation was the Britons, or the Britain Society, formed in 1919. This was anti-Semitic and kept the now debunked publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion going until the mid-1920s. It helped convert a few people to anti-Semitism, but it wasn't really significant. Technically though, the first third positionist movement in Britain was a National Socialist movement. The first British fascist organisation was founded in 1923, sort of. Rotha Lintorn-orman was concerned that the socialists were going to destroy private property. She therefore founded a movement that was designed to protect private property. And then, knowing nothing about him, she looked at Mussolini in Italy and decided, yep, he seems to have smashed the Red Menace, so let's copy him. And she did. She founded the British Fascisti. However, apart from the name and the fact that she had her people wear blue shirts, there wasn't anything fascist about it. And when a lot of real fascists and National Socialists joined the movement, attracted by the name, they were disappointed to find out that it wasn't real fascism. Some were even annoyed that it was run by a woman and was full of feminists, which they didn't like. Or if they were Nazi, they found it wasn't anti-Semitic at all. But because real fascists were attracted to the name of the British Fascisti, the movement started hemorrhaging members after peaking in 1925. That year, 100 actual fascists broke away and formed the National Fascists, and then got into fights with the Labour Party and the Communists. And another split occurred in 1926 over the general strike because Orman offered her fascisti as workers to the establishment, causing a split within the movement over whether to support the strike or not. Her movement then rapidly declined, not helped by the fact that she was an alcoholic and on medicinal substances. Thank you, YouTube censorship. Her rich mother cut her allowance after getting fed up of the intimate parties involving lots of people kissing each other at her London home, so the movement eventually dissolved in 1934. However, there was someone from the British Fascisti who later went on to join the British Union of Fascists, and I think they are important. Nesta Helen Webster was a Gnostic. Wikipedia, of course, doesn't say she was Gnostic, because we've got to hide the Gnosticism, but she was. She admitted she had mystical experiences with black magic and hypnosis. She believed in the downfall of society and revolution, blaming the Jewish Kabbalah and the Freemasons. She ended up writing about the occult, and how much she actually influenced the British Union of Fascists, I'm not sure. However, the connection to Gnosticism is direct if it wasn't already there. A group that formed as a result of the downfall of the British Fascisti was the Imperial Fascist League. These were definitely National Socialist. They were the self-proclaimed Jew-wise Gnostics who were awoken, gnosis, to the so-called racial issue. I know the Imperial Fascist League has fascist in the name, but as I've explained before, these are different to fascists. Arnold Leese was in command of the IFL, and he believed that Italian fascism had been corrupted by the Jews. He therefore said that his movement was modelled after German National Socialism, but then killed it fascist anyway. He also went on about things like the pure British blood, the Nordic blood, and the white European races, which you won't find in Mosley's literature. More militant than the British fascists, although even fewer in numbers, were the groups that could be seen as closest to the Nazis in their thought and inspiration. These were the self-proclaimed Jew-wise, an odd mixture of reactionary conservatives and racial fascist enthusiasts, whose obsession with political anti-Semitism was to lead to an alternative tradition in British fascism to that provided by Mosley. Obviously, Thurlow has got his Marxist goggles on too tight because they're not reactionaries or conservatives. However, the point is that even Thurlow can see that these were an alternative tradition to fascism. and the reason why is because fascism and National Socialism are two separate ideologies, something Thurlow finally admits several pages later. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because it's all going to be extremely important shortly. The good news is that the Imperial Fascist League only had about 150 members at its peak, 50 of which were the core enthusiasts under Arnold Leese. The Nordic League, which was founded in 1937, got maybe 400 people at their meetings, so not very many. British National Socialism was then, and always has been, tiny. The British Union of Fascists, peaking at maybe 50,000 members, were the only significant third positionist organisation in Britain during the interwar period. If you haven't seen my video on why Mosley turned to fascism, now is the time to do it. There I explained the background to the founding of the British Union of Fascists, as well as Mosley's personal struggle with the other parties in Britain, so it's definitely worth checking out. The British Union of Fascists, the BUF, was founded in October 1932 at the peak of unemployment during the Great Depression. So, therefore, the first thing Mosley does was release a plan to combat unemployment based on his previous actions within the Labour Party. The plan was the Greater Britain. Let's see what Mosley says he's going to do.
The main object of a modern and fascist movement is to establish the corporate state. In our belief, it is the greatest constructive conception yet devised by the mind of man. In psychology, it is based on teamwork. In organisation, it is the rationalised state. The producer, whether by hand or brain or capital, will be the basis of the nation. The forces which assist him in his work of rebuilding the nation will be encouraged. The forces which thwart and destroy productive enterprise will be met with the force of national authority. The incalculable powers of finance will be harnessed in the service of national production. Class war will be eliminated by permanent machinery of government for reconciling the clash of class interests in the equitable distribution of the proceeds of industry. Wage questions will not be left to the dogfight of class war, but will be settled by the impartial arbitration of state machinery. Existing organisations such as trade unions and employers' federations will be woven into the fabric of the corporate state, and will there find with official standing not a lesser but a greater sphere of activity.
Mosley didn't yet believe in the racism he would adopt a couple of years down the line. And so, as Hitler pointed out in Mein Kampf, if a national or social movement fails to understand the importance of the race, then they would do nothing more than compete with Marxism on its own ground. Mosley realises that all he's doing is renaming Marxism and giving it a syndicalist coat of paint, and so he does his best to distinguish himself from the communists. He says that fascism wants to build, unlike Marxism which wants to destroy.
In this respect, fascism differs profoundly from its opponent, communism, which pursues class warfare to the destruction of all science, skill and managerial ability, until when it begins to feel its feet, it has to buy these same qualities at enormous cost from foreign nations. This precisely describes the course of events in Russia. The first task of Leninism was to destroy, to root up every tree in the garden, whether good or bad, merely because it had been planted by the enemy. Then, when destruction had brought chaos on the heels of famine, there came a 5-year plan of American conception, implemented by a nucleus of German and American technicians hired at immense expense. Such is not the method of fascism. Its achievement is revolution, but not destruction.
The problem was that the British workers were already in the communist or labour movements. And as we all know, once you're in the wizard circle, it's really hard to break out of that. Once they start reading The Guardian, that's it, they're lost. You may as well pack up and go home at that point. And that's what Mosley came up against. They didn't know what fascism was, but they hated it anyway, thinking that it was something that it wasn't, when in reality it was no different from the communist or labour movements, which the people who hated the fascists loved. So the workers were already hostile to fascism, none of them would listen, and Mosley couldn't get any support from the very people that his movement was designed to help.
Mosley envisioned his movement as a progressive, modernising one, capable of attracting working men and ex-socialists by its social programme.
But he failed to do this. It would be no different if the communists couldn't find recruits from the so-called working class. Their movement is designed to attract the workers. So a communist movement without worker support is what? Nothing. And that's exactly what happened to Mosley's fascism. Mosley was competing on the same ground as the communists, and failed to do so. And just like the communists of today have failed to retain worker support and are now disingenuously turning to gender and race as a means to find artificial support for their so-called worker socialism, well, that's exactly what Mosley was ultimately forced to do with British fascism.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Part of the reason why Mosley failed to recruit from the workers was because unemployment peaked in the summer of 1932. It then slowly went down, which reduced the appeal of fascism, communism and labour socialism altogether. Well, the British Union of Fascists was only created on the 3rd of October 1932, which was after the peak in unemployment during the summer. So right from the beginning, the support base for fascism and communism, which isn't the workers, it's the unemployed, was continuously shrinking, meaning that Mosley was constantly swimming against the flow of the water.
Another reason was because, even though his movement was called the British Union of Fascists, he failed to unite the other fascist movements in Britain. Some of them did join, but a lot of them did not. Despite negotiations, a merger with the British Fascisti was vetoed by Rother lintorn-orman, who saw Mosley as a communist. A few members did come from the British Fascisti though, after which the British Union of Fascists and the British Fascisti ended up in violent conflict with each other.
During the Jewish protest demonstrations against the Nazis in Hyde Park on 23rd of July 1933, a small lorry carrying British Fascisti in a counter-demonstration shouted abuse at BUF headquarters. In retaliation for this, and fearful that they might be blamed for any fascist hostility towards the Jews, between 50 and 60 BUF members wrecked the BF's headquarters.
So, the British Fascisti were out in a counter-demonstration against the Jews and shouted at the British Union of Fascists, who then, fearful that they were going to be branded as anti-Semites because they weren't at this point, smashed up the British Fascisti headquarters. Well, clearly things are more nuanced than the all fascists are Nazis narrative. That's a gross misinterpretation. Mosley had not yet developed his anti-Semitism, which brought him and his British Union of Fascists into conflict with the British Fascisti, who were anti-Semitic but weren't real fascists. And then Mosley put financial pressure on Orman's fascists in 1934, causing them to go bankrupt. So these were rival factions, and the situation is far more complicated than the simple narrative we often hear. Historian Thurlow says that Mosley tried to merge Arnold Leese's Imperial Fascist League into his own faction in the April of 1932, but the Imperial Fascist League was National Socialist, not fascist, even though it had fascism in the name, and so they just couldn't do it.
As there were no quarrel with Jewry, there were Jewish members. Kid Lewis, the boxer, who was a Jew, was one of the earliest blackshirts. The anti-Semitism of the German movement was then regarded with distaste by most British fascists, and our disagreement with it was expressed in our early literature. It was felt it was a purely German manifestation, and no business of ours, nor we let it influence our own tolerant attitude to British Jews. Relations rapidly deteriorated with the Imperial Fascist League. Leese saw Mosley as an unprincipled opportunist and argued that his fascism was not based on racial nationalism. He was also extremely suspicious of Mosley's first wife, Cynthia Curson, accusing her of having Jewish blood in her veins. To Leese, Mosley was a kosher fascist, a Jewish agent planted to discredit the whole concept of fascism in Britain. To Mosley, Leese was no more than an anti-Semitic crank.
Mosley's fascists went in with rubber truncheons and knuckle dusters, and beat up the IFL members, including Arnold Leese, who had his trousers torn off and was thrown into the street as a way to humiliate him. effectively rendering the IFL impotent. So Mosley's fascists were beating up Nazis. The British Union of Fascists also smashed up the headquarters of the British United Fascists in 1933, and then in 1936 did the same to the Social Credit Greenshirts, which I don't know enough about, but I think were also fascist, before moving on to attack the National Socialist League in 1937. So again, this wasn't a united front, and part of the reason they weren't able to gain much ground in the grand scheme of things is because they failed to unite.
I myself met Mussolini about half a dozen times, and Hitler twice, neither of them after 1936. In those critical years, I was much too busy at home to go abroad at all. Our fault was not union, but division. Yet it arose from the natural cause that we were different in our policies and outlook, by reason of the national characters of our movements.
Mosley goes on to describe how the British Union of Fascists tried to hold meetings and give speeches, but hecklers and protesters were there to disrupt the proceedings, which would often end in violence. He gives an example of Churchill having to deal with the same thing in 1922, years earlier, and in case you were wondering, Churchill never joined the fascist movement. Another Conservative MP said the same thing had happened to him at several previous elections, so Mosley correctly points out that he didn't invent the violence in British politics. It was already there.
Force was used against us, and we used force in return. I hate force. I had more than enough of force for fighting in Iron Trench in the First War. But when my meetings were attacked, I either had to close down or defend them, and I organized their defense, and we won. We had orderly meetings, and that was our whole offense. They used violence against us, and we had to use violence in return. No, but I don't like it, I hate it.
Incidentally, the interviewer from that video, which you can find on YouTube, is completely stumped by what Mosley says at this point, as well as other points in the video. So they cut to the next part where the interviewer has his head down, trying to understand what had just been said, and then come up with another question. If you blink, you might miss it. The interviewer clearly had a preconceived notion of what fascism is, and Mosley flummoxed him by coming out with the complete opposite. Another reason why we need to understand this topic properly. And let's be clear here, even without the anti-Semitism, fascism and National Socialism are stupid ideologies, along with communism and socialism in general. Economically and socially, they don't work, and they actually hurt the workers or whoever they pretend to support, not help them. If you read Mises' Socialism, which is free online, you'll find out why. So, I'm not sympathetic to fascism or any of these other Gnostic religions at all. However, even approaching this from a non-fascist point of view, I'm compelled by the evidence to concede that Mosley's fascists may have been largely on the defensive against the Reds. Yes, they use violence in defence, and they did launch their own attacks, they're not innocent, but they appeared to be mainly on the defence, and the other parties were equally, if not more, violent. And I actually have a source for that. Thurlow, who is a Marxist, says that the communists and socialists were as, if not more, violent than the British Union of Fascists. In addition, it's absolutely clear to me that most people don't know what fascism is. They just know that they hate it. And that's what Mosley found out. He discovered that even though his movement was built for the workers and the unemployed, at least in theory, the workers and the unemployed hated him.
We were a new movement, and we were entirely dependent upon the spoken word at public meetings to find the support which did not yet exist. It was perfectly clear that we were to be denied by organised violence this sole opportunity for political progress. What were we to do, pack up and go home? Or organise ourselves to defend our meetings? A few of my valued associates chose the first alternative, I chose the second.
I spoke about this in the previous video. Mosley's British Union of Fascists had to react to what he called red violence. And we can cry about this or deny it, but the evidence is clear. The violence associated with British fascism was largely a reaction to red violence. And yet, only the fascists are seen as violent thugs. Well, the Labour and Communist movements should be viewed the exact same way because they were equally as violent. So Mosley used stewards to kick out hecklers and protesters from their meetings, many of whom were armed with various weapons like razors, knuckle dusters and iron bars, meaning that they weren't hecklers or protesters. The fascists even made a little museum to showcase all the weapons they had collected from fighting with their enemies. And what's worse is that we have evidence of deliberate police bias in favour of the Marxists. At a meeting at Manchester's Free Trade Hall in March 1933, where fighting had broken out between interrupters using chairs and fascists wielding rubber truncheons, the police had intervened to exclude the stewards. Since then, Mosley had consistently refused to allow the police into his meetings. This historian, Martin Pugh, goes on to ask if Mosley had an ulterior motive for not allowing the police into his meetings due to the fact that the violence helped the fascists gain popularity. Well, that might be a subsidiary reason, but I think the fact that the police were on the side of the Marxists might be the primary concern. And we've got to ask, why were the police only removing the stewards? Removing Mosley's defences would have only encouraged the Marxists to be more violent, and the fascists to be defenceless against such violence. So the logical reason why was because this would discourage the fascists from conducting their meetings in the first place, thus removing them from the political scene. So it's no wonder Mosley didn't trust the police. Thurlow says that in 1933 and 1934, communists and militant Jewish youths were assaulting black shirts who were selling newspapers. Therefore, anti-Semitism was growing within the ranks of the British fascists, who had largely not been anti-Semitic before this point. Now, I want to make this clear. The Jews were seeing what was happening in Germany with the National Socialists and were reacting accordingly. And their reaction to the Nazi issue is understandable. The problem was that fascism and National Socialism are two separate ideologies. But the Jews, and many others in Britain at the time, and still to this day, do not understand that there is a difference. People mistakenly believe that fascism and National Socialism are the same thing. In fact, I would say Arnold Leese didn't realise this either, which is why he put fascism in the name of the IFL, even though it was National Socialist. So, from what I can tell via the sources, which are admittedly problematic, the Jews were attacking the British Union of Fascists, thinking that they were National Socialists, and the fascists reacted to those attacks by becoming more anti-Semitic. If this is indeed what happened, then this is why it's important to understand the misunderstanding. This is also why Mosley protested his innocence so often about the Jews in his books and in his interviews.
Well, because I never wanted to persecute Jews myself. I simply defended my meetings from Jewish attacks.
Now, he could be lying. It could be part of his propaganda effort or whatever. However, from the sources I have, plus the knowledge of the ideological difference between fascism and National Socialism, which I'm knee-deep in the argument over on this channel, I don't think he is lying. He and his followers seem to be very consistent on this issue, and other sources seem to back them up on this as well. It could genuinely be the case that the popular Marxist worldview falsely put fascism and National Socialism together, and everybody just believed it. But Mosley only turned against the Jews in July or October of 1934, possibly a little bit earlier. And even then, as Mosley and the historians say, it wasn't on racial lines, it was on national lines.
Now let us be absolutely clear about this question. I was never anti-Semitic, and I'll define anti-Semitic. By that I mean someone who attacks Jews on account of race or on account of religion. I had a quarrel, not with all Jews, but with some Jews about one subject, whether there should be a Second World War or not. Now, coming back from the First World War, after that time in the air and in the trenches and in the loss of all my friends, I was very strongly against another war. And it seemed to me, rightly or wrongly, that's a question we could debate, that certain Jews were trying to provoke a Second World War because their compatriots or co-religionists were admittedly having a very bad time in Germany. Now, I do not think that a minority in this country should pursue a policy contrary to the national interest, which can, and in fact which did, result in the loss of 50 million lives. That gave rise to a very bitter quarrel of the period, in which harsh things were said and harsh things done, because they attacked our meetings. But I was not before that, and I have not been since, or even at the time, was not anti-Semitic, because not all Jews were involved, but only some.
Your interpretation might be different, and that's fine. But if you notice, he defined National Socialism as attacks against Jews on account of their race or religion. He did not define attacks on Jews on account of their nationality as being anti-Semitic. So the question is, do we define anti-Semitism on race and religion only, or do we define it as race, religion, and nationality? According to Merriam-Webster, anti-Semitism is defined as hostility towards or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. Well, that's not national or patriotic. Other sites say it's just a general hostility towards Jews. However, Mosley also said that he was only hostile to some Jews, not all. If this is the case, and it's obviously debatable, but let's just assume for a second he's telling the truth because there is evidence to support this in the literature, then how does that work? Does hostility towards some Jews but not others count as anti-Semitism? Personally, I think he became anti-Semitic but would have tolerated Jews living in Britain had they conformed to the British standards as laid down by the fascist state he was going to construct, because that is precisely what he said in the late 1930s.
The British Union of Fascists, when it comes to power, will treat Jews and Gentile on their merits. Both will be under the same law, and both will be called upon to put the welfare of the nation before any sectional or racial interest.
So there is a debate over this. However, regardless whether you think Mosley was or wasn't anti-Semitic, in 1933, Mosley still hadn't adopted the anti-Semitism he would later be accused of, and that's perhaps why, when the first major BUF march occurred in June 1933, and 1,000 black shirts marched through London, they were completely ignored by their opponents. There was no reason to stop them. But when the anti-Semitism started to ramp up in the November of 1933, the British government decided to start monitoring the fascists. Lord Rothermere was also persuaded by Mussolini to support Mosley in 1934, and his newspapers, especially the Daily Mail, provided a massive boost to BUF membership figures. Mosley attempted to win over more intellectual circles as well, forming the January Club on the 1st of January 1934 to discuss political issues with MPs, lords, and even a brigadier general. Perhaps 350 people attended the club, which was operated in expensive hotels over dinner, going against the idea that they were just thugs who liked violence. However, it's been suggested that the roots of the movement were weak, which is why Mussolini was financing Mosley. If he hadn't done this, then the movement probably would have collapsed. The British state realised that the fascists only had weak support from the British people, and thus weren't a serious threat, which goes against the woke left narrative that British society has been and is inherently fascist. No, the evidence doesn't support that conclusion. The British were militantly anti-fascist in the 1930s and 40s. Now, it's debated, but historians have said that support for the British fascists peaked in mid-1934, stating that the violence at the Olympia meeting on the 7th of June turned people away from Mosley. 12,000 people were at the event, including 150 MPs, nearly a quarter of all the MPs, and the communists decided to disrupt the meeting. 1,000 anti-fascists attended what the propaganda later referred to as the counter-demonstration, which is ridiculous. It wasn't a demonstration at all. These mostly peaceful protesters were armed with knuckle dusters and razors. So, when the hecklers and protesters were carted off by the black shirts, fights broke out in the foyer. Up to 70 people ended up in hospital, with 2 of the 5 people staying overnight being black shirts. Inevitably, because of all the Marxist and establishment propaganda, both are on the same side. The fascists got blamed for all of this. But why attend the meeting if you're not a fascist? You're only there to disrupt it, which means the anti-fascists were the cause of the violence. They were the attackers. No anti-fascists, no violence. But nonetheless, historian Thurlow rallies behind his Marxist friends and says the fascists deliberately overreacted to the Marxist attacks. What, they overreacted to knuckle dusters and razor blades?
The counter-demonstrators were not relying either on their vocal cords or their fists to stop the meeting, as was evidenced by the nature of the wounds and injuries sustained that evening by our stewards and supporters, and by the candid confession of participants on their side, such as Philip Toynbee, a product of rugby school who became an active communist, in his reminiscences of buying knuckle dusters and attacking a steward. According to Wikipedia, this communist, Philip Toynbee, was the grandson of the Hegelian Arnold Toynbee that I mentioned in the previous video about Mosley. Just thought I'd point that out. I wonder if he ever got arrested for assault. We collected a strange assortment of weapons from the gentle hecklers during the course of the evening. Apart from koshers, iron bars, knuckle dusters and razors, usually wielded by Reds, and prized from them after sanguinary struggles with the stewards, this time could be included a cobbler's awl, a short-handled chopper and a curry bomb. Anyone with stable experience can appreciate this as a weapon.
Mosley says they organised a dressing station at Olympia because they knew in advance that they were going to be attacked. 7 Special Branch members were in the audience, probably in plain clothes, but nobody else. The British police knew that the communists were going to attend, because the Reds had announced it numerous times in their newspapers, and the police knew there was going to be violence. But Thurlow says the British police deliberately stood back and let it happen. Now, yes, Mosley had refused to allow the police to attend his meetings after the police had previously sided with the attackers, but surely they could have insisted on attending, or just shut it down before it even began. Yet they didn't. The official history of the British Union of Fascists quotes from a Conservative MP who may be sympathetic to Mosley's cause, but nonetheless this MP states,
to describe, as certain sections of the press have done, organised gangs of hooligans as hecklers or genuine interrupters who, attempting to elicit further information, were brutally assaulted and forcibly ejected, is to give a wholly erroneous impression of what actually occurred. The fact is that many of the communists were armed with razors, stockings filled with broken glass, knuckle dusters and iron bars, that they had marched from the East End, the police kindly escorting, with the avowed purpose of wrecking the meeting. A friend of mine saw a woman fascist with a razor cut across her face, and with my own eyes I witnessed gangs of communists resisting ejection with the utmost violence.
Regardless, Thurlow blames the fascists for the attacks, even though they were quite clearly on the defence in this instance, as Special Branch and historian Martin Pugh also conclude. Surely the attackers should be the ones to be blamed. And I'm not saying the fascists shouldn't have been opposed. Yes, they should be peacefully opposed. But I'm disheartened to report that what we have here is a significant bias in the sources. I mean, wouldn't you deliberately overreact to being attacked with razors and other weaponry? Especially since it was effectively sanctioned by the British police. Mosley quotes from a nurse.
A girl fascist with a scratch commencing under her eye and running down her cheek and neck and finishing on her back between her shoulder blades. I do not think this scratch could have been done with a fingernail, but that some sharp instrument must have been used. While treating this case, another girl fascist was brought in. She had been struck by a man and her glasses smashed in her face. She was bleeding from the region of her left eye.
Historian Martin Pugh concludes that the MPs in attendance were from other parties, and they wanted to discredit Mosley and the fascists as much as possible, since Mosley was gaining support at their loss. Could we then not surmise that the British police did not intervene until the later stages because the establishment wanted the violence to occur so that they could conduct a massive propaganda campaign to convince the public that it was indeed Mosley's fault? And before I get accused of conspiracy theorising, 150 MPs were in attendance. The media were all over the show. The communists were armed and well organised, despite supposedly being poor workers and unemployed. The police stood back and did nothing, and there were 7 special branch members in the audience. You know, is it a stretch to say that this was a setup? The sarcasm in the official history of the British Union of Fascists is certainly warranted on this occasion.
Next day, Britain resounded to indignant voices denouncing the fascist atrocities. Apparently, Mosley planned to attain power by booking large halls, inviting the public to enter them, and then unleashing his black-shirted thugs to beat up his helpless audiences so savagely that they would be sure to vote for his candidates at the next election.
Historians have interpreted the outcome of Olympia in different ways. Some say that it was the turning point of Mosley's movement. The argument goes that opinion shifted away from Mosley after all the propaganda that followed Olympia. The problem with this narrative is that we have evidence that violence in every other instance actually helped to gain Mosley's support, not take it away. So for example, at the Battle of Cable Street, which happens later, the violence caused membership of both the communists and fascists to rise. So why would violence at Cable Street and elsewhere cause an influx of support, but violence at Olympia specifically somehow cause a decline? There's a contradiction there in the overall narrative. Also, as Pugh points out, opinion was actually mixed, with some members of parliament in favour of the violence and the use of stewards to defend their own meetings, which every party was doing anyway. Readers of certain newspapers came to the conclusion that the fascists were the victims. Pugh also notes that Special Branch concluded that the event spurred an unprecedented fillip to recruitment, fillip meaning stimulus.
The truth is that while the violence alienated some people, it also added to the appeal of the BUF among the young and militant anti-communists, with the result that the organisation experienced a major turnover of membership during 1934-35.
We could get into the nitty-gritty over this, but it's not worth doing that today. In a nutshell, my interpretation currently is that Olympia might have been the high point, but wasn't the turning point in the fortunes of Mosley and the BUF. The reasons why fascism in Britain failed are different, and I'll come back to discuss that in a future video. For now, it's clear that Mosley gained a few extra members after the Olympia meeting, and membership of the BUF probably peaked in late 1934 at somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people. I must point out though that that number is a guess from a problematic source and is probably an exaggeration. So what are our conclusions? Well, I think the first thing is that red violence probably helped the BUF and gave it support. Shocking, I know, but punching a Nazi or a fascist is only going to help their cause. It's only going to strengthen them and confirm to them that they're right. Violence will persuade neutrals that fascists and Nazis are being persecuted, providing them with sympathy, which is perhaps how this video will now come across, because the Reds were absolutely in the wrong in this instance. So as tempting as it might be to a Marxist to punch a Nazi, you might want to consider the consequences of your actions. And by the way, it's the same for anyone considering reacting to the woke mob. The best thing to do is ignore them. Don't give them what they want. If you react, they win. If there was little to no anti-Semitism in the British Union of Fascists from 1932 to mid-1934, then why were the Reds attacking them in the first place? And the answer is because they were fighting for the same ground for the unemployed, the workers, and the socialists in general. Marxists and the establishment don't want competition, and so they attacked the fascists with all their might and propaganda, pretending that fascism was the end stage of capitalism. The attacks on Mosley during the early 1930s exposes the lie in the popular Marxist narrative. There was no anti-Semitism. Only later did the anti-Semitism come about, which the socialists and communists then hid behind to justify their actions. But in reality, they were violently against fascism because it was a direct competitor to their own brand of Gnostic statism. It's also clear that the historians that I've read, not many admittedly, are approaching this from a Marxist perspective, which is problematic to say the least. Both Pugh and Thurlow are trying to paint Mosley's British Union of Fascists as conservatives. They're so far off the mark, they need to go to the opticians, which I don't recommend they go alone because they're that blind they won't be able to find it. So their interpretation of the events leaves a lot to be desired, and it's clear that they're not questioning the narrative that they've bought into. As a result, I'm reluctant to recommend their books. There might be some, historians out there that, I haven't read that are better, but currently I'm at a loss as to what to recommend on this topic. And obviously the primary sources are also largely biased, and I'm not sure I can recommend them either. Ideally, I'd rather you start with a secondary source that's decent enough so you're prepared against the propaganda inherent within the primary sources, but the secondary sources are so skewed to the other side, I can't do that. So we're left with the propaganda of the primary sources. Mosley probably is lying to some extent or downplaying certain factors, as are his fascists. However, I'm currently of the view that he's correct on the red violence issue. I also think he did fight against Nazis and other fascists who were his competitors and then turned anti-Semitic in 1934 arguably as a result of an understandable Jewish reaction to German National Socialism. If this is the case, and again there's always a doubt, then this does highlight the general misunderstanding of what fascism is compared to National Socialism, and why it's important to learn from history so we don't repeat it and don't push people into the third positionist camp. If you don't know the differences between fascism and National Socialism, here are some videos that will help you with that. Thanks for watching, bye for now.